One thing this earth isn't short of, it's different diseases or viruses. And while some may be fairly harmless to modern medicine, others remain deadly as ever. Today we'll be looking at this mystery illness that ravaged through this remote tribe in New Guinea. Almost bringing them to the point of extinction, the symptoms alone are enough to send shivers down your spine, like this is not something normal that you'd hear of at all. With 100% mortality rate, this disease was the very first known case of its kind, and even today there is no known cure. But after decades of research, when it was determined how this illness was spread, it was unbelievable, and it changed everything. It was a hot evening in the summer of 1950. Lynn was partaking in a customary ritual that was part of her tribe. She's part of the Fore tribe, located deep in the forest of Papua New Guinea. On this specific day, it was her sister Ila's funeral. Ila had died 4 days earlier from a mystery illness that's been going around the village called kuru. This mysterious illness has been around for a few years, so the local Fore people know all about it. Or so they thought. The illness follows basically the same path whenever someone gets infected. Basically, the victims start to feel a slight tremble that would gradually get worse over time, loss of coordination and control over your muscles, and eventually death. Kuru is a death sentence. They knew that much. Once you had it, you're gonna die for sure. And there's no cure or medicine known to help the symptoms. Kuru was killing on average over 200 people in Lynn's village every year, which in 1950 only had around 11,000 or so people. To make things even weirder, the victims were disproportionately women and children as compared to men. Now that's a little odd, as why would a disease or virus target females or children, and how was it even doing this? Nobody knew, but they did know that if things kept on like this, they would go extinct. There's no doubt about it. But the Fore people had a different view towards kuru, to say the least. Instead of seeing it as virus or infectious agent of sorts, it was viewed as sorcery and bad magic. So basically, the Fore people believe that there is someone out there in the vast wilderness, maybe another member of a different tribe, that has placed this curse on the person with kuru. So in their tradition, after a member dies, they'll have an elaborate send-off. So everyone would get together and give a hand in making it big and festive. Because after the rituals and the funeral service, if they got everything just perfect, the person's spirit will rise and seek revenge on the sorcerer who cursed them with kuru to begin with. About 8 months after this funeral had taken place, Lynn suddenly noticed her hand was slightly shaking while tending to her potato crop. She knew at that moment deep down exactly what that meant, but in denial, she refused to admit it. As days turned into weeks, it became evident. Lynn had kuru. She knew that now there was a stopwatch on her life, and there's absolutely nothing she could do about it. Just as everyone in the village before that had the misfortune of being cursed by kuru, the only thing left to do now was wait to die in one of the most horrific ways possible. Lynn tried to seek help in desperation and did something that was never before done in her tribe, and that was to seek help from the white people. You see, Australians have made contact in and around the Fore people's tribe, and few were actively researching and collecting data on this mystery illness. And so, in her sick state where she could hardly walk, she would make her way out of her village and went to this house who she knew was not a tribe member simply by the way it looked. This house belonged to Ronald Byrne, who was a social anthropologist, and she tried begging him for help, but she could hardly make sense as the disease had progressed to the point where she had difficulty speaking. It was evident she had kuru, and Ronald knew this and was able to figure out she wanted help. However, he purely believed that this disease was psychosomatic and was all in their heads. He had no useful information to help Lynn, so she went back on her way to her village. She didn't want to die like this, but she didn't know what else to do. After some time, Lynn lost more than half her weight and the ability to walk or use any of her muscles. She was bedridden, and the whole village was starting to make preparations for what's to come. About a week later, while painfully laying in bed, Lynn would start to laugh hysterically for no reason. Nothing was funny, and you could see in her eyes that she was actively in pain, but she just couldn't stop laughing. This was because in the terminal stages of Kuru, victims would start laughing uncontrollably for prolonged periods of time. It's as if their brains have been hijacked and they have lost complete control of themselves. This would cause the Kuru virus to go by another name, the laughing sickness, despite there being absolutely nothing funny about it. Lynn would die shortly after this, and as usual, they would have an elaborate send-off hoping her spirit would exact her revenge. This trend would continue for years. In 1961, Shirley Lindenbaum happened to be looking over some old medical notes when she came across this document talking about this mystery illness over in Papua New Guinea. And after she looked into it further, she realized that there was basically no research done on this disease. The only information she could find was that of Ronald's. Shirley was an adventurous woman, and just about a year later she decided to travel to Papua New Guinea and do some research herself, maybe solve this mystery once and for all. I mean, in Ronald's research, he stated that these people are suffering from something in their heads, that it's all psychosomatic, but it didn't make sense. After landing, she was able to successfully make contact with some of the fore people in various villages. She was dedicated to learning the ways and customs of these people and find out why it is that there's this incurable disease killing them. While exploring these villages, she came across Dr. Michael Alpers. He was a white man, which means he stood out like a sore thumb. She would go over and introduce herself. To her surprise, he's been living within the village among the people for a while now, trying to figure out what's really going on with this Kuru disease. They immediately started working together, exchanging various information and hypotheses, and they both would agree that obviously this isn't psychosomatic. There was a few different thoughts Shirley had as to why this disease was spreading. She thought it might be hereditary, being passed down from parent to child, but that thought was soon out the window as they would notice that Kuru would spread among non-relatives. She then thought it was contagious. However, if it was, how come she or Dr. Alpers, who's been in the village for months, didn't get infected? It didn't make sense. And it also didn't explain why only women and children were vastly more affected by this. In this village, there was a 12-year-old boy suffering from Kuru, and at the time he was basically in his final stage, the laughing stage, meaning the only thing left is a slow, agonizing death, and the whole village, as usual, would be preparing for this young boy's funeral service. Dr. Alpers and Shirley would talk with the parents, basically asking to do an autopsy on the child's body after he passed, and, out of desperation and fear of going extinct, they agreed. And a few days later, the boy would die and Dr. Alpers would conduct an autopsy as promised. The very moment him and Shirley would look at this boy's brain, they both knew immediately that something was horrifically wrong with what they are looking at. The boy's brain appeared shrunken and shriveled up, but the weirdest part had to be the holes all over his brain. It appeared as if something had been eating and digging through his brain. This was very peculiar and didn't make sense, so they would send off this finding to the National Institute of Health so they can research and figure out what it is they just discovered. A few months had passed with no word back, until a little over a year, Shirley would receive a letter titled to her from the NIH. Eagerly she opened it and began reading, and this letter would basically say that after all the research they did on the boy's brain, they weren't able to find out what Kuru is technically. Was it a disease, a virus, or what? They didn't know, but what they did find out was how it spread. What they did was inject a syringe full of infected brain tissue into a chimpanzee, and after 2 months, it was infected with the Kuru disease, which also means it was able to cross the species barrier and infect other primates. But how one person's infected brain tissue would get into another person's brain was still a mystery. Or was it? The moment Shirley read this, she knew exactly how something like this would happen. You see, a few months earlier when Shirley went to New Guinea and she was getting familiar with the many beliefs and customs of the local people, one thing that she did learn was that they believed that each person had multiple souls, 5 to be exact. After someone dies, they would have that big elaborate send-off, basically so that soul can exact its revenge on whoever cursed them. And out of the other 4 souls, there was one that was the most dangerous, that was called the quila, basically meaning flesh. To the fore people, the flesh was a signal of death and decay, as that's basically what happens to our bodies when we die. So in order to protect the rest of the village and stop the quila from polluting the air, it's believed that this spirit has to be taken care of and protected, and the best place to do so was inside the bodies of the fore women. Women are seen as more strong and resilient than men, therefore they are the perfect candidate. So a few days after the person dies, a massive feast is prepared, but only of the deceased person's remains. So they are chopped up, cooked, and the whole corpse would be consumed. Now the brain was the best part and is always left reserved for close relatives of the deceased. So when Lin's sister died, Lin would consume her brain, leading to her getting infected. It was also very common for the adults to sneak some of the brain to the kids, as it was a delicacy. This would explain why majority of the infected turned out to be women and children. As peculiar as this might sound, this act of ritual cannibalism was an act of love and kindness. However, in retrospect, it would turn out this was the very worst thing they could have done if they didn't want to follow the dearly departed. After this discovery, the Australian government would ban the act of cannibalism on the island of Papua New Guinea and encourage the fore people to stop eating each other, and out of desperation they did, and cases would slowly start to decline. Kuru can lay dormant for decades before becoming a problem. So there were a few cases after a few years, however. The last known documented case was in 2009, and now the fore population is higher than it was in the 1950s. In the 1990s, doctors would finally figure out that Kuru is basically a malfunction of protein in the brain. So prions in the brain would fold wrong and was unable to work properly, which killed brain cells and led to the brain shriveling up and causing all those holes noticed in the young boy's brain. It's not known exactly how this disease started, but is believed that someone close to one of the fore villages had developed a very rare disease of the brain, and when he died, he was chopped up and consumed, which led to the start of Kuru. It's also interesting to add that in 2009, researchers found a naturally occurring variant of a protein in a population from New Guinea that would have a very strong resistance to the Kuru disease. This would also lower their chances of getting other prion-related diseases, such as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and other neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. Throughout history, the interaction between humans and viruses has shaped societies, influenced population dynamics, and driven advancements in medical science. The ongoing study of viral diseases remains essential for global health. And while this will go on until the end of our time on this planet, there will always be some viruses that remain unconquered and will be the stuff nightmares are made of. If you found today's story interesting, please like and subscribe, as it really does help out the channel a lot. See you on the next one.